So one of the common things that happens on the political spectrum is that people tend to focus on problems. And I think part of the reason why that is because as soon as you come up with a solution, you get told pretty consistently the same thing, which is be realistic. And a lot of the people who tell you to be realistic sort of just assume that they're in the center of the political spectrum because they can see both sides and blah, 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 blah. Or it's like, you tend to either be center left, center right, or dead center. Like that tends to be how you present yourself. And it's just wrong. Like history is about change, History is all about how society was one way, then something happened, and then things changed. That is history. That's the whole point of that field. So to tell someone to be realistic is basically saying history is going to stop right here. Nothing is changing. That's what's likely to happen. And there's times of stability, but I don't know if you've noticed things aren't exactly stable at the moment. Everything's in chaos. The planet is dying. We've got like a celebrity in the White House who kind of got put there by Russians, and the only reason why no one's gotten arrested for it is because people were too stupid to like do things the way you would expect them. Be realistic. What part of be realistic makes any sense of where we are now? We are not in a realistic time. Realistically, the planet is going to cook. We have to be unrealistic. We can't afford to not have imagination. Just because you're telling someone to be realistic doesn't make you realistic. That just means that you think realism is something that is valuable. Which is fine. Nothing wrong with actually being realistic. But the problem is that realistically, a lot of things are possible. I don't think there's any way of escaping that. Realistically, one person's not going to make a difference. But realistically, if everyone thinks that, nothing's going to get done. Realistically, no one, we all do our recycling, don't we? If I don't do my recycling one week, you're right, that doesn't make much of a difference. But you know what? We have products made that used to be other products, and that is keeping at least some of the garbage out of landfill. We just can't see how much worse it would be if we didn't do our recycling. Realistically, heavy scare quotes, you can't make a living as an artist. And yet we have all kinds of people making livings off of YouTube, either through ad revenue if they're larger, or through Patreon if they're medium to small. Once one person starts doing something, then the idea starts to spread. Once it becomes a viable lifestyle for one person, then all of a sudden other people around them you can see it work. How much more likely are you to do something if you've seen someone actually make a proper go of it? I basically don't make a decision now without going on YouTube and trying to see someone who made that decision I'm thinking about making 12 months earlier, just to see what it's going to be like for me 12 months down the line. So realistically, do what you have to do. Tell people, do what you think is right. Tell people about what it's like. Tell them about why you're doing it. The whole problem with Be Realistic is it's the kind of thing that stops people being actually legitimately involved in politics. It stops people going out there and doing the things that we need to do. When people tell you to be realistic, they're basically telling you to give up and not cause any trouble, because it makes them uncomfortable. Be realistic doesn't really mean be realistic. Be realistic just means submit to the status quo. And the status quo is literally killing all of us right now. That's what's realistic. What's realistic is everything's going to go wrong. But the thing is, there are things we can do. And if we do those things, and if we show people that you can make these changes and it's not a big deal, it's not the biggest cost to you. In fact, it can even be kind of romantic. I mean, just look at the tiny house movement. If you went back 20 years, say, and said, people are going to start wanting to live in shipping containers. It's going to become very, very cool to live in basically no space, and to basically be like a bit of an eco-warrior. Veganism is, people get kind of fed up with vegans. It's like, vegans are just going to convert and stuff. Thing is, vegetarians used to be that. Slowly but surely, the perception of what is crazy has shifted because of that. Realistically, change will be slow, but change won't happen unless you do it. And there are organizations out there who are making change. I said this in the last video. There are already people out there who are doing this kind of thing. And there are people who are planting trees and making everything a better place, you know. And the more people we get doing that, the more likely we are to actually be able to change things for the better. And we don't have the option of not doing that. If you have the imagination, and if you think through the execution of it, so much as possible. Be realistic just means you have no imagination, and we can't afford people without imagination right now. This is why it's so important that we keep making art, because art, while it's not necessarily directly political, art is an act of defiance that says, I can see things in a certain way. I can see things outside of, well, usually it means that I can see things outside of the mainstream narrative to some extent. Here's how I see it. The act of creating something for its own sake, which is what art is. Like, that runs counter to consumerism, that runs counter to just everything that's used to manipulate people politically. It is an exercise in imagination and possibility, and that is what we need. We need to think and imagine and dream, because at the moment we can't even think of new stories to tell ourselves. We're stuck in the superhero narrative where someone's just gonna swoop in and save us from the pillar of light in the sky. That's not a very healthy narrative. We need to start coming up with new stories in which small things become bigger things. And there are movies like that out there, but they've gone out of style lately. And I think it's because people have given up hope, and all we're doing is just hanging around and waiting for someone with a big idea to come in and just everything will just get fixed by itself, basically. We need to find new narratives because we can't afford to stick with this one. And be realistic means exactly that. It's just stick with the status quo because it's all we've got. And that's not true, because it hasn't always been like this. There was a time before the 1980s where institutions actually stood for something. There was a massive cultural revolution in the 1960s where all of a sudden, post-war, people woke up to the idea that the institutions weren't doing what they were supposed to be doing and were kind of responsible for war, and that people on the ground needed to start believing in things again. Things like peace and love and equality and all this other kind of stuff that we're all about on the political left. And and there've been plenty of stuff like that before, but the problem is throughout the 70s and 80s, everything started becoming commodified as corporations got more and more control over the ability to tell narratives. This is why it's so important to support grassroots artists. They're the ones who are telling a different narrative, one that does not serve the interests of the powerful. If you know of literally anyone doing anything outside of the usual systems, it is so important to support them, because they're the ones who are trying something new, who are doing things in a new way, and we need new ways of doing things. Even if it's not going to work on a grand scale, it's just enough it's got to be something just to break us out of our mindset of things that have always been like this and always will be like this. If you want to start supporting artists by supporting me, I have a Patreon link down below. Until next time, much love.